There are men who mistake a silent man for an empty one, and I have spent the better part of my life standing very still, while such men made that mistake to my face. My name is Halvard Renn, and for 19 years I have stood the king's watch at the west gate of Harrowgate Castle. I have held that post through downpour and drought, through a state funeral and 2 coronation eves, through the long gray afternoons when nothing happens at all, and the only movement in the forecourt is the slow travel of the sun across the cobblestones. I have learned that a gate is not merely a place you keep. It is a promise you make with your body, that whoever passes through it does so on the terms of the crown and no one else's. Break that promise once, and a castle stops being a castle. It becomes a house with a big door. So when Lord Cassius Vane came through the west gate that morning with 4 of his hangers-on trailing behind him like the tail of a comet, laughing about something before they had even reached me, I did what I always do. I stood, eyes forward, chin level, rifle at the shoulder, white gloves crossed at the small of my back where the sun could not find them. I made myself into what the tourists call a statue, and what my sergeant called, more honestly, a witness that cannot be intimidated. I should tell you who they were, because their names matter to what came after. Cassius was the son of Queen Consort Morwenna, the king's second wife, and no one's idea of a mother to the house of Harrowgate. He was perhaps 26 that year, handsome in the way a coin is handsome, all edge and stamp and nothing underneath. He wore a coat that cost more than I earned in a season, and he wore it the way a man wears a thing he did not buy himself. Behind him came his usual court, a lean fellow named Doran who laughed before the joke was finished. A pair of twins, sons of a wine merchant Morwenna had raised to a barony, who dressed alike and thought alike and had never in their lives been told no. And a young woman, Lady Sabine, who filmed everything on the little silver phone she held before her like a lantern. They had come, I would learn, because Cassius had made a wager. I did not know that yet. I knew only that they slowed as they reached my post and that Doran said, loud enough to carry, "There he is, the king's dog. Watch, he won't so much as blink." "He'll blink," said one of the twins. "Everyone blinks." 10 crowns says he doesn't. 10 says he does before the bell. And Cassius, standing dead center in the arch of the west gate where 19 years of Harrowgate discipline said no man loiters, looked me up and down as if I were a horse he was thinking of not buying. "He'll do more than blink," he said, "before I'm done. My mother says these men are furniture, expensive furniture. Let's see what it takes to move the furniture." I have been called worse. I have been called it in 3 languages by a drunk viscount who tried to climb the railing on a coronation night, and I did not move for him either. There is a thing they teach you on the very first day at the barracks, before they teach you to march or to load or to salute. The post is not about you. The moment you make it about you, your pride, your temper, your urge to answer the boy who called you furniture, you have already lost the post. The uniform is the king's. The stillness is the king's. Your face, for the hours you wear it here, is the king's face, and a king does not brawl with a boy over 10 crowns. So I stood. Cassius stepped closer. He was near enough now that I could smell the wine on him, not drunk but warmed by it, the courage of the cellar. He leaned in until his face filled the corner of my vision, and he said very softly in a voice meant only for me, "Do you know what I could do to you? 1 word to my mother. 1, and you'd be sweeping stables in Blackmore by winter. You're nothing. You're a costume with a heartbeat." I looked past him at the far wall, at the little bronze lion set into the stone above the inner arch, worn smooth on the nose by 300 years of superstitious hands. I have used that lion as my anchor for 19 years. When a man wants me to look at him, I look at the lion. It does not care what Cassius Vane could do to me. Neither, in the moment, did I. Doran had drawn out his own phone now. Lady Sabine had circled to my side to get a better angle. This is the part the young ones never understand. They think the camera is a weapon pointed at me. It is not. In 19 years I have learned the deep and comfortable truth that the camera is patient, and the camera is fair, and the camera does not know whose side it is on. It records the man who keeps his post, and it records the man who mocks him with exactly the same indifference. And later, when both are shown to strangers, the strangers always know which is which. Cassius, growing bored of soft menace, decided to escalate. He reached up and flicked the brim of my bearskin, a light, contemptuous tap, the sort of thing you might do to a hanging sign to hear it swing. The cap did not move. It is fitted and it is heavy, and it takes more than a lordling's finger to disturb it. But the gesture landed on the crowd that had begun to gather, a dozen visitors near the gate, a cluster of schoolchildren on a tour with their teacher, an old man with a folding stool who came most mornings to sit in the sun and watch the changing of the guard. A gasp went through them. Not at me. At him. "Still nothing," said the twin who had bet against a blink, sounding almost disappointed. "Then we go bigger," said Cassius. "Here is what you must understand about a post like mine, and about the rules that govern it, because the whole of what happened that day turns on those rules, and Cassius Vane did not know a single one of them. I am permitted to speak, but only to give a lawful command: make way, stand back from the arch. The gate is closed, and only when the security of the post requires it. I am permitted to move, but only in the drill and only in defense of the person of the king, the castle, or an innocent under my protection. I am not permitted to be provoked. That is not a suggestion. It is written into the standing orders in the plainest language the guard possesses. A guardsman does not answer insult with insult, nor mockery with force. His discipline is the crown's dignity. If he loses the one, he spends the other. Cassius believed those rules were a cage he had found me locked inside. He believed the very thing that made me formidable, that I would not, could not, break for him, was the very thing that made me helpless. He thought he had found a man he could do anything to, because that man's whole training forbade him to react. He was half right, and the half he had wrong was the half that ruined him. Because those same standing orders that bind my temper also bind everyone who comes near my post. The West Gate is not a stage he had wandered onto. It is a controlled approach to the private apartments of the royal house. And there is a duty officer. That morning it was Captain Inez de Lacroix, a hard, fair woman I would have followed into a burning granary, whose entire task is to watch the gate on the little screens in the guardroom, and to record, and to act on what the guardsmen at the post cannot. I do not have to answer Cassius. I do not have to move. I only have to hold and be seen holding, while the machine of the castle turns quietly behind me and takes the exact measure of the man in the arch. Cassius thought the stillness was surrender. The stillness was a net, and he was walking deeper into it with every step, and he had no idea, because the net was made of the one thing his mother had never taught him existed: consequences that outrank her. "Bigger," he said again, and he turned to Doran. "Give me your coat." Doran, puzzled, handed it over, a fine gray traveling coat, still warm. Cassius took it, and with the flourish of a man doing something he thinks is clever, draped it over the muzzle of my rifle, over my crossed hands, over my forearms, so that it hung there like washing on a line. "There," he announced to the crowd, spreading his arms. "A coat rack. The king's finest, a coat rack and a fur hat. Sabine, are you getting this? Post it. Caption it. Harrowgate's proudest soldier." The crowd did not laugh. That is the detail I remember most sharply from the whole morning, how the laughter he wanted did not come. The schoolchildren had gone quiet in the way children do when they sense they are watching something wrong and cannot name it. The old man on his stool had stopped smiling. A woman near the front, a visitor with a map in her hand, said, not loudly but clearly, "Leave the man alone." Cassius heard it, and a man like Cassius, denied the laughter he came for, does not stop. He doubles. "Leave him alone," he rounded on the woman, delighted to have found a target that would react. "He's not a man, madam. He's a fixture. He belongs to us. All of this belongs to us." He swept his arm at the gate, the forecourt, the towers, the flag. "My mother wears the crown of this house. Do you understand what that makes me? It makes me the future of everything you're standing in. And this, He jabbed a finger at me, the coat still hanging from my arm. This is what serves me. Say it doesn't. Go on. The woman did not answer. She looked away, embarrassed for him, which is the one reaction his kind cannot bear. And into that silence, from the small door beside the guardroom that the public never notices, stepped Captain Delacroix. She did not hurry. That is the mark of the thing. A castle in good order never hurries. Hurry is the sound a castle makes when it has already lost control. She came across the cobblestones at a measured pace, her boots very loud in the quiet, and she stopped 4 feet from Cassius Vane, and she looked at the coat hanging off my rifle for a long, cold moment. "My lord," she said, "remove that." Cassius smiled at her. He had a smile for women in uniform that I had seen before and disliked intensely. "And you are?" "Captain Inez Delacroix, duty officer of the watch." "I gave you a lawful instruction. Remove the coat from the guardsman's weapon." "Weapon?" Cassius laughed. "It's a prop, Captain. He's a prop. You're all props." But he reached out lazily and pulled the coat off and tossed it back at Doran without looking. "There, happy. Now while you're here I'd like the gate opened. The inner gate. I'm going up to see my mother, and I'd rather not walk the long way around like a tradesman. The inner apartments are closed to visitors this morning." "I'm not a visitor, I'm family." "You are on the visitors list under your own name, my lord, which means for the purposes of this gate you are a visitor, and the inner apartments are closed." Delacroix's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You are welcome to wait in the forecourt, or to leave through the gate you entered. Those are the 2 things available to you." I watched Cassius's face while she said it, and I saw the exact moment the morning changed for him. The moment he understood that this woman was not going to be charmed, or bullied, or invoked away by the name of his mother. He had built his whole life on the certainty that a name was a key that opened every door in the kingdom. And here was a plain oak door, and here was a woman standing in front of it, and the name did not fit the lock. He did the thing that men like him always do when the name fails. He got louder. "Do you know who my mother is?" "I do, my lord." "Then you know what she'll do to you." "I know what the standing orders say I'm to do, captain to lord, this morning at this gate. I'm doing it. What the Queen Consort chooses to do afterward is the Queen Consort's business, and I'll answer for my conduct to the King's Marshal, who wrote the orders I'm following." She let that sit. "Would you like his name so you know who to complain to? I'll write it down for you." That is the difference between a person of the crown and a person of the court, and I have never seen it drawn so clean. Cassius invoked a person. Delacroix invoked a rule. And a rule, if it is a good rule and honestly kept, is stronger than any person alive, because a person can be flattered or frightened or bought, and a rule that 100 disciplined people have agreed to keep cannot. Cassius did not have an answer for that, so he reached, one more time, for the only lever he understood. "Furniture," he said to me, not to her because she frightened him and I did not. "You heard her insult my mother. You'll remember that when I'm master of this castle. All of you will remember." He stepped very close again, closer than before, close enough that I could see the little tremor of rage in his jaw. "And you," his voice dropped to that private snake's whisper, "I'm going to have your post. Your 19 years, I'll have them for a joke. Watch me." I looked at the lion above the arch. I did not know, standing there with the smell of wine and the small crowd holding its breath, that the king himself was already awake 300 feet above us, and that the little silver phone in Lady Sabine's hand had, 40 minutes earlier, posted a video to the whole watching world that would reach him before noon. I did not know that the wager Cassius had made in his cups the night before, that he could break a king's guardsman before the noon bell, and film it, would be the last free morning he ever spent in Harrowgate Castle. I knew only my post, and my orders and the lion. So I held, and the net drew tight, and the bell had not yet rung. Captain Delacroix did not leave. She took up a position 4 paces off at the edge of the arch, where the standing orders permitted her to observe without crowding the post, and she folded her hands behind her back in an echo of my own stance, and she waited. That was itself a message, and Cassius read it correctly and hated it. She was not going to fetch him tea, and she was not going to go away. She had drawn a line in the cobblestones as clear as if she had scratched it with her heel, and the line said, "You may stand in this forecourt and make a spectacle of yourself for as long as you like. You will not pass this gate, and every minute you spend here, more people will see the kind of man you are." Cassius, denied both the guard's reaction and the officer's fear, turned to the one resource he had never run short of in his life: an audience. "Doran," he said, "the bet's still live. I said before the noon bell. We've got what the better part of an hour." He clapped his hands together, a horrible bright sound in the tense quiet. "New plan. If the furniture won't move, we make the furniture look like furniture. We make a proper show of it. Sabine, put the camera up high, get the gate, the towers, the flag, all of it, and get me in front of it, and get him behind me looking exactly as stupid as he looks. This is going out tonight. The Vane family at home in Harrowgate. Let's remind the kingdom whose house this is. I want to be careful here in the telling, because it would be easy to make Cassius into a cartoon, a snarling villain with no inside to him. He was not that. That is the trap of remembering an enemy. You flatten him, and by flattening him you lie about how the thing really happened and how it might happen again. Cassius Vane was, in that hour, a young man who had been handed a great deal of the world and taught nothing about how to carry it. His mother had raised him on a single lesson, repeated so often it had gone down into his bones, that he was owed. Owed deference, owed the gate, owed the guard, owed the whole gilded engine of the castle, simply for having been born close to a crown that was not even truly his. No one had ever once made that lesson false to his face, not his tutors who were paid by his mother, not his friends who were fed by his allowance, not the servants who feared his mother. He had reached 26 years of age, genuinely believing that reality bent to the Vane name, because in the small, warm world his mother had built for him, it always had. The west gate of Harrowgate Castle was the first place in his life that would not bend. And that not his cruelty, which was ordinary, not his arrogance, which was common. That is the true engine of what happened to Cassius Vane that day. He walked into the one place where his mother's name was not law, kept doing the thing that had always worked, and could not understand why the world did not do what it was told. Every escalation was him pushing harder on a door that was never going to open, and calling it the door's fault, and pushing harder still, until at last he pushed himself right through into the sight of the only person in the castle whose name did outrank his mother's. But that comes later, first the show. Sabine climbed onto the base of the old mounting block by the wall, a squat block of granite where riders once stepped up to their horses, worn hollow in the middle, and she held the phone up over her head, and she framed the shot the way Cassius wanted it. Him in the center, the gate and the towers behind, and me small in the corner of it, the co-track, the joke. "Now," said Cassius, warming to his role, playing to a lens rather than to me, "watch how the king's finest handles a real test." He reached into his coat and drew out a handful of copper coins. I did not know what he intended, and for a bad half-second I thought he meant to throw them at my face. Coins are hard, and thrown at the eyes they can do real harm, and there is a version of that morning where he does exactly that, and everything after goes differently and worse. But Cassius, for all his cruelty, was a coward at his center, as such men usually are, and he did not have it in him to actually strike a man who might strike back. So instead he did something smaller, and, in its way, more revealing. He knelt. He knelt right there at my feet on the cobblestones in front of the crowd and the camera, and he began to lay the copper coins out on the ground before my boots, one by one in a neat little row, the way you might leave payment for a busker. "For the performance," he announced, loud and delighted with himself. "A gratuity. For the coat rack. Ladies and gentlemen, we tip our servants at Harrowgate." He set down the last coin and stood and dusted his knees and turned to the camera with his coin-bright smile. Now watch. He's not even allowed to pick it up. He has to stand there over his own tip like a man with more dignity than you'll own if you live to 90, said the old man on the folding stool. The crowd's held breath let go, not in a laugh, but in a low murmur of agreement that ran through the visitors like a wind through wheat. The old man had said the thing they were all feeling, and having heard it said aloud, they were no longer a nervous audience to Cassius's show. They had become a jury. I have thought often in the years since about the coins on the cobblestones. There were 9 of them, small and dull, in a crooked little row between my boots and the crowd. Cassius meant them as an insult so pointed I would have to feel it, to make me stand guard over my own humiliation, unable even to sweep it aside. And I want to tell you honestly what I felt, standing over them, because the truth is more useful than the noble version. I felt anger, of course I did. I am not a statue. The statue is a costume I put on. Underneath it, Halvard Renn is a 50-year-old man with a bad knee and a daughter at the Naval College, and a temper he has spent his whole adult life learning to hold. And that man wanted, very badly, for one hot second, to take the boy by his fine collar and set him down hard on the cobblestones next to his little coins and ask him how the tip looked from there. But here is the thing the standing orders understood that Cassius never would. The anger is not the enemy. The anger is fuel. The discipline is what decides where the fuel goes. And I had learned over 19 years and 10,000 hours of standing very still that the surest revenge a disciplined man can take on a man who wants him to break is simply to not break, to make the other man's whole performance land in silence, so that the emptiness of it echoes back on the performer and swallows him. The coins were meant to shame me. I let them shame him. I gave him nothing, no flinch, no glance down, no tightening of the jaw, and by giving him nothing I made a mirror of my own stillness. And in it the crowd saw, with perfect clarity, exactly which of the 2 men in that arch was small. Captain Delacroix saw it too, and she made a small decision that would matter enormously. She took out her own notebook, a real one, paper and pencil, the kind the guard has used since before there were screens, and she began, very visibly, to write. She wrote standing up, in plain sight of Cassius and the crowd and the camera, and she narrated as she wrote in a clear administrative voice as if she were reading out a shopping list. 9:40 in the morning, she said, writing. West Gate. A lord's son on the visitors list given a lawful instruction to leave the post area. Refuses. Places coins at the feet of a guardsman on duty in an attempt to provoke. Names the Queen Consort in a threat against an officer of the watch. Films the same. She looked up. For the record, my lord, you understand this is being recorded by the castle's own cameras as well as your friend's telephone. Both records will be kept. I only mention it so that, when this reaches the people it's going to reach, no one can say you weren't told. For the first time that morning, something crossed Cassius Vane's face that was not contempt. It was the very smallest beginning of fear. Because Cassius had assumed, as men like him always assume, that the camera was his, that the record was his to shape, that the story of this morning would be the story he told tonight, over wine, with the video edited to show the coat rack and cut out the coins, and that in that story he would be the clever young lord who put the king's dog in its place. It had never once occurred to him that the record might belong to someone else, that the same footage he thought was his trophy might become the evidence against him, that a plain woman with a pencil could be building, calmly, in front of his eyes, the case that would undo him. You're bluffing, he said, but it came out thinner than he meant it to. I'm writing, said Delacroix. There's a difference, a bluff you can call. A record you have to live with. And she went back to her notebook, and the pencil moved and the crowd watched, and the coins gleamed dully on the cobblestones, and above the inner arch the little bronze lion looked down on all of it with its worn smooth nose, and I stood over my 9 copper coins with my eyes forward and my hands crossed and gave the boy nothing, 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 and felt the net, though I still could not have told you its shape, drawing slowly, patiently, inexorably tight. I have to leave my own post now for a little while, and tell you what was happening above my head, in the parts of the castle I did not see, because a fair telling of that morning cannot be only the view from the west gate. I learned these next things afterward, some from Delacroix, some from the king's private secretary, some from the king himself, in the one long conversation he and I would have about that day, months later, over a pot of tea in a small warm room that no lord's son will ever be invited into. Here is what was happening above. Queen Consort Morwenna was awake and dressing when the first message reached her. It was not from her son. It was from an acquaintance in the city, one of those useful, poisonous people who make their living knowing things first, and it consisted of a single line and a link. Your Cassius is going viral at the west gate. You'll want to see this before it's everywhere. Morwenna watched the video. I have imagined that moment many times, and I confess I take a certain hard satisfaction in it, which I am not proud of and will not pretend away. She watched her son kneel and lay coins at a guardsman's boots and call the man furniture, and she watched a crowd of ordinary people turn against him, and she watched a duty officer stand in front of a gate and refuse him with the whole quiet weight of the crown, and she understood, because whatever else Morwenna was, she was not stupid. Her cruelty was intelligent. She understood at once that this was a disaster, not for the guardsman, for her. Because the video did not read the way Cassius thought it read. He thought it showed a Vane putting a servant in his place. What it actually showed to every person who watched it was a rich boy tormenting a man who could not answer, and losing to the man's silence, losing to a plain officer's calm, losing the crowd, losing his dignity coin by coin. It showed exactly the thing Morwenna had spent years trying to hide, that the Vanes were not the future of Harrowgate but a splinter in its side, grasping and small, and that the castle's own people, its guards, its officers, held them in a contempt so total that a duty officer would stand in an archway and tell the Queen Consort's son to his face that his name did not fit the lock. Morwenna's first instinct was the instinct of every powerful person caught in a mistake, to make it go away. She reached for her telephone to call the marshal's office and demand the castle footage be suppressed, the duty officer disciplined, the whole matter buried under the smooth, heavy blanket of a great house's silence. She got as far as dialing. And then her hand stopped, because a servant had come to the door of her dressing room, pale and out of breath, to tell her the one thing that changed everything. The king had seen it too. King Alaric was 71 years old that year, and he was not the vigorous young sovereign the old paintings showed, but he was very far from the frail figurehead his enemies liked to imagine. He had ruled Harrowgate for 40 years. He had buried a wife he loved, the late Queen Isolde, whose memory still hung over the castle like a better weather, and he had made, late in life and against the counsel of everyone who cared for him, the mistake of marrying Morwenna, a mistake he understood more clearly every passing year. He was tired and he was grieving still, and he had let a great many small things slide because a tired, grieving man does let things slide. Morwenna had built her whole strategy on that sliding. She had spent years learning exactly how much she could take, how far she could push her son and her daughter Verena and her whole hungry court into the life of the castle, precisely because the king no longer had the fight in him to stop her over small things. But the king had a rule of his own, older than his tiredness, older than his grief, older even than his crown, and Morwenna had forgotten it or never known it. The rule was this: Alaric of Harrowgate would let a great many things be taken from him. He would not let anyone be cruel in his name to a man who could not answer back. He had learned that rule at the West Gate himself, 60 years earlier, as a boy. I have this from his own mouth, when he had seen his own father, the old king, stop his carriage to reprimand a courtier who was baiting a sentry, and had heard his father say a thing that Alaric never forgot. The measure of a house is not how it treats the men it must impress. It is how it treats the men who must not answer it. Remember that when the house is yours. So when the king's private secretary brought him the video that morning, brought it reluctantly, expecting to have to talk his tired sovereign into caring, he found that he did not have to talk him into anything at all. The king watched it once in silence, standing at the window of his study with the gray city spread below him. He watched his wife's son kneel and lay the coins. He watched the crowd turn. He watched the guardsman, me, though he did not yet know my name, stand over the coins and give the boy nothing and hold and hold and hold. And when it was finished he did not rage, and he did not send for Morwenna, and he did not reach for a telephone. He simply set down the little device, and he said to his secretary, in a voice the secretary described to me later as the quietest and most frightening he had ever heard the old king use, "Have they gone yet, the boy and his friends? Are they still at the gate?" "I believe so, Majesty. It's still happening." "Then I'll go down, now, as I am." He was in a plain morning coat, no crown, no chain of state, no ceremony. "No, say nothing to the Queen Consort, say nothing to the marshal, send no one ahead. I don't want a procession. I want to walk down to my own gate and see with my own eyes what is being done there in my name." He paused at the door. "And find out the guardsman's name before I get there. A man who holds like that for a foolish boy and a row of coins. I would like to know who he is when I thank him." That was the king, going down the great stair alone in a plain coat. At the very moment I stood over my 9 copper coins, believing myself entirely forgotten by everyone but a cruel young lord and a patient captain. The game had changed, and I did not know it, but Morwenna knew it now, and Morwenna moved. She could not stop the king. No one stopped the king when he had that quiet in his voice, but she could try to get to the gate before he did, and reach her son first, and pull him out of the fire before the king arrived to find him in the middle of it. So she abandoned the telephone and the suppression and the whole careful machinery of a cover-up, and she did something I do not think anyone had seen the Queen Consort do in years. She ran. Down the private stair, along the gallery, her fine morning gown gathered in one fist, a lady-in-waiting hurrying uselessly behind her, running to save her son from the consequences of a lesson she herself had taught him. 2 people were now converging on the west gate. The king, walking, calm, terrible in his quiet. The Queen Consort, running, frantic, cursing her son under her breath. And between them at the gate, entirely ignorant of the storm bearing down, Cassius Vane was about to make his final and worst mistake. Because I have not told you the last thing he did before the king arrived. I have saved it because it is the hinge of the whole day, and because it is the moment my discipline stopped being a shield I hid behind and became, instead, the thing that armed everyone else. Cassius, you will remember, had bet that he could break me before the noon bell, and the noon bell was creeping closer and I had not broken, and his friends had begun quietly, then less quietly, to laugh at him rather than with him. Doran had stopped filming. One of the twins had said, "Cass, let's just go, this is dead." The wager was slipping away from him, and worse, the crowd was no longer his audience but his judge, and worst of all, that plain captain kept writing in her little book. Cassius could feel the morning turning against him, could feel the ground he had always stood on tilting, and he did not understand why. And a man who does not understand why he is losing does the most dangerous thing a man can do. He panicked, and he reached for the child. I must be very careful now, and very exact, because this is the part of the morning that could have gone terribly and did not, and the difference between the two was measured in a single step and a fraction of a second, and I will not dress it up as more than it was, nor less. Among the schoolchildren on the tour, I have said there was a cluster of them, perhaps a dozen, aged 8 or 9, with a harried young teacher. There was a small boy who had drifted, as small boys do, a little apart from the group and a little too close to the arch, drawn by the coins on the cobblestones and the strange still soldier and the whole bright confusing spectacle of it. His name, I would learn, was Perrin, and he was the kind of curious that no fence can quite hold. He had crept forward to the very edge of the coins, crouched down, staring up at me with his mouth open, entirely unafraid, in the way of a child who has not yet learned that men can be dangerous. Cassius saw him, and in his cornered, sinking, panicking state, Cassius had one last idea for how to win his wager and his crowd back, the worst idea, the one that finished him. "You," he said to the boy, bright and false and terrible, "come here. Come stand by the coat rack. Let's get a picture, the future of Harrowgate and its youngest subject and its stupidest soldier. Come here." And he stepped toward the boy and put out his hand to take him by the arm, to pull him into the frame, to make a prop of a child as he had tried to make a prop of me. I want to tell you what the standing orders say about that moment, because everything I am, everything 19 years had made me, lived or died in it. The standing orders say I do not react to insult. They say I do not answer mockery with force. They say I hold my post and give the provoker nothing. And I had obeyed those orders all morning, through the whisper and the flick of my cap, and the coat on my rifle and the coins at my feet. I had obeyed them perfectly, because to insult me is to insult the king, and a king does not brawl. But the standing orders say something else, older and higher than all of that, and it is the first line a guardsman learns and the last he forgets. A guardsman moves in defense of the king, the castle, or an innocent under his protection. Cassius had been within his rights, in the narrowest legal sense, to torment a grown man in uniform who was trained to bear it. He was within no rights at all, of any kind, in the sight of God or the king or the standing orders, to lay a hand on a frightened child who was not. The instant his hand moved toward the boy, my duty inverted. Where a heartbeat before my whole task had been to not move, now my whole task was to move, and I did. I broke my post. For the first time in 19 years I broke my post, and I broke it the way I was trained to, the way I had drilled 10,000 times and prayed I would never need. Not in anger, not in a brawl, but in one clean, controlled, protective motion. I did not strike Cassius. I never touched him. I took a single long stride to my left, put my own body, the rifle brought down in a cross, not as a weapon but as a barrier, held level in both gloved hands between Cassius Vane's reaching hand and the child. And I spoke, for the first time all morning, in the plain, clear command voice the guard teaches. "Stand back from the child." 4 words, that is all. I did not raise the rifle at him. I did not lay a finger on him. I simply put myself in the length of my weapon, held crosswise like a bar, between a grown man and a boy, and gave a lawful command in defense of an innocent, exactly as 19 years of orders had prepared me to do, and my voice, I am told, carried the whole length of the forecourt and stopped every conversation in it dead. Cassius froze with his hand in the air. The boy Perrin scrambled back, unhurt, untouched, more startled by the great sudden voice than by anything else, and ran to his teacher who gathered him in, and he was safe. He was never truly in danger of real harm. Cassius was a coward, not a monster, and I do not think he would actually have hurt the child. But he would have used him, seized him, frightened him, made a helpless prop of a boy for a photograph. And that, the using of the helpless, is a wrong the guard does not permit to happen in front of it, whatever the standing orders say about insults to ourselves. There is a difference between what a man may do to a soldier sworn to bear it, and what he may do to a child who never swore anything. Cassius had crossed from the one to the other, and in crossing it he had, at last, done the single thing that freed me to move. And here is the terrible, beautiful irony of it, the thing I did not have the wit to appreciate until much later. Cassius had spent the whole morning trying to make me break. He had bet on it. He had staged an entire show around it. And I had denied him and denied him and denied him. And then, at the very end, he got his wish. He made me break my post. He made the statue move. But it did not break the way he wanted. It broke against him. Because a guardsman who holds his post through insult and mockery and humiliation, and then breaks it, moves, speaks, acts, only to protect a child, has not been defeated. He has been vindicated. Every second of stillness before that moment now meant something. It meant that this was a man who could bear anything done to himself and would not lift a finger for his own pride, and yet would move like lightning the instant a child was threatened. It drew in one motion the perfect line between the two, not a man who could not react, but a man who chose, with iron judgment, exactly what was worth reacting to. The stillness had been the setup. The child was the payoff. And Cassius, in his panic, had written that ending himself. The crowd erupted, not into a laugh now, into a roar, the deep, involuntary roar a crowd makes when it has watched a wrong met by exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. The old man on the stool was on his feet. The woman with the map had her hand over her mouth. Sabine's camera, which Cassius had meant as his weapon, had caught every frame of it, the reaching hand, the crosswise rifle, the forward command, the child safe in his teacher's arms. And it would go out that night not as Cassius had planned, but as its exact opposite. And it would be watched, before the week was done, by more people than lived in the whole kingdom. Captain Delacroix had already moved. She was between Cassius and the arch now, her hand raised, and she was saying in a voice that brooked nothing, "That's enough. That is enough. My lord, you will come away from this gate now, and you will." And that was the moment, precisely that moment, with Cassius frozen and the crowd roaring and the child safe and my rifle still held crosswise between us, that two things happened at once. Queen Consort Morwenna arrived, breathless, at the outer edge of the forecourt, one hand pressed to her side, her gown disordered, her face a mask of fury and fear, opening her mouth to command, to threaten, to save her son and salvage the morning. And behind her, unhurried, in a plain gray morning coat, having come down the great stair alone as he said he would, King Alaric of Harrowgate walked through his own west gate into the middle of it all, and every single person in that forecourt, seeing him, went utterly silent and turned and bowed. I have stood a great many ceremonial moments in 19 years, coronation eves, state funerals, the arrival of foreign kings with their trumpets and their guards of honor. None of them had the weight of that plain old man in his plain gray coat walking alone into the forecourt of his own castle. There was no trumpet. There was no announcement. There did not need to be. Power that must announce itself is not yet sure of itself. The king's power was so old and so settled, and so complete that it moved through a crowd like a change in the weather, and every knee in the forecourt bent to it without a word of command. Every knee but two. Mine, because a guardsman on his post does not bow. He comes to attention, and I did, snapping the rifle up out of its crosswise bar and back to the shoulder, heels together, eyes forward, the child safe behind me, the discipline reasserting itself over the whole scene like a hand smoothing a cloth. And Cassius's, because Cassius Vane, in the frozen shock of the moment, had simply forgotten how, and stood gaping at his stepfather, the king, with his mouth open and his hand still half raised, the very picture of a boy caught. King Alaric stopped in the center of the forecourt. He looked first, not at Cassius and not at Morwenna and not at me, but at the child. At Perrin, half hidden in his teacher's arms, wide-eyed at the sudden press of grown-up drama. The king's hard old face softened just slightly, just at the eyes. "Are you well, lad?" he asked. His voice was gentle and carried perfectly. "No one's hurt you." The teacher, white as paper, managed. He's fine, Majesty, he's fine. The guardsman," she looked at me and her voice caught, "the guardsman kept him safe." "So I see," said the king. And he let his gaze travel at last slowly around the whole of the forecourt, the coins still scattered on the cobblestones, Sabine frozen on the mounting block with the phone still held over her head, Doran with the gray coat clutched to his chest, the twins pale and edging toward the gate, the crowd of visitors and schoolchildren, Captain Delacroix standing straight with her notebook, Morwenna gasping at the edge of it all, and finally, and last. and with a weight that seemed to press the whole forecourt into the ground, at Cassius Vane. "Well," said King Alaric, "my wife's son at my gate." On his knees to a soldier, from what I'm told, laying out coins. Alaric, Morwenna started, moving forward, her voice already sliding into the tone I would come to know well, the tone that had smoothed over 100 of her son's disgraces, the tone of a mother who had never once let her boy face a consequence. "Alaric, it's a misunderstanding. The boy was only—" "Be quiet, Morwenna." He did not shout it. He said it almost gently, the way you might tell someone the time. But it fell on the forecourt like a stone dropped down a well, and Morwenna, Queen Consort Morwenna, who had bent the whole castle to her will for years, who ran a court and terrified servants and had very nearly convinced a tired kingdom that she was its future. Morwenna stopped, and closed her mouth, and went white, because she heard in those 3 words a thing she had spent years praying she would never hear. The sound of her husband deciding, at last, to no longer slide. "I have watched your son's mourning," the king went on to her, but loud enough for all. "The whole of it, on the little machine. I watched him call this man furniture. I watched him hang a coat on a king's guardsman as though the man were a peg in a hall. I watched him kneel and lay coins at the feet of a soldier to shame him, and I watched the soldier give him nothing, Morwenna, and I have never in 40 years on this throne been prouder of a man in my colors than I was of that guardsman standing over those coins giving your son nothing." His voice hardened, tear by tear, like frost forming. "And then I watched your son reach for a child, for a boy of 8, to make a prop of him. And I watched this guardsman break a 19-year post. I have his record in front of me, 19 years unblemished, break it in one clean motion to put himself between your son and that boy, and lay no hand on your son and speak 4 words and make the child safe." He turned from her, finally, to Cassius. 4 words. "Do you know what they were, boy? Stand back from the child. That is the whole of it. That is what he did to you. He told you to stand back from a child, and you have made me ashamed to share a roof with you." Cassius, cornered, did the only thing left in his shrinking repertoire. He tried to invoke the name. "Your Majesty, she's my mother. I'm the Vane name." "The Vane name," said the king, "is your mother's and your mother's alone, and it will pass with her, and it has never for one instant been mine or this house's. And if you invoke it at my gate again to excuse cruelty, I will strip it of every courtesy the crown has ever extended it this morning, before that bell rings. Do you understand me?" He let that sit, and then, more quietly and somehow worse, "You thought his silence was weakness. You thought a man who would not answer you could not answer you. You have the whole thing backwards, boy, and you always have, because your mother raised you backwards. A man's silence at a post like this is not the absence of power. It is power held. It is a loaded thing kept level. And the reason you never saw it fire is that you were never worth firing it at until you reached for that child, and then you saw exactly how fast it moves. You spent a morning trying to prove this man was nothing, and you have proved to the whole watching kingdom that he is worth 10 of you, and that I am well served, and that you are not fit to stand in the shadow of my gate. That is your morning's work. I hope the wager was worth it." The forecourt was so silent I could hear the flag snapping on its pole 300 feet above us. Then the king turned to Captain Delacroix. "Captain, you are the duty officer." "I am, Majesty." She stood very straight. "You told my wife's son his name did not fit the lock. Those were the words, I'm told." A flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossed her face. She did not know yet whether she was about to be commended or broken. "Those were the words, Majesty. I'll answer for them." "You'll answer for them by being thanked for them," said the king. "You held the gate with a pencil and a plain voice, and you never once raised either. You made a record when a lesser officer would have made a scene. You are exactly what I want standing at my gate, and I will tell the marshal so myself today before I do anything else." He inclined his head to her, the king, to a captain in front of the Queen Consort's son, and I saw the whole meaning of it land on the forecourt. This is who I honor, and this is who I do not. And then, at last, King Alaric of Harrowgate turned to me. He crossed the last of the forecourt slowly. His knees, I think, were near as bad as mine, and he stopped in front of my post, close, the way Cassius had stood close, and for a strange moment the two of them overlaid in my sight. The boy who had leaned in to whisper that I was nothing, and the old king who now leaned in to say the opposite. And I understood, standing there at attention with my eyes forward on the little bronze lion, that this was the true meaning of the whole morning, that the same stillness could be tested by contempt and honored by a crown, and that the stillness itself did not change. Only the men who met it did, and were measured by it. "Look at me, guardsman," the king said quietly. A guardsman on his post keeps his eyes forward, but a lawful command from the king is the one thing that moves them. So I dropped my gaze from the lion for the first time all morning, and I looked at my king. His eyes were very tired and very kind and very hard, all at once, in the way of a man who has ruled a long time and lost a great deal, and kept his soul intact through both. "What is your name?" "Halvard Renn, your majesty." 19 years at this gate, Halvard Renn." 19 years, majesty." "And in 19 years, how many times have you broken your post?" "Once, majesty, this morning." Something moved behind the old king's eyes. "For a child." "For a child, majesty, the orders permit it, in defense of an innocent under our protection." I paused, and then, because he had asked me a true question, and a true question deserves a true answer, even from a statue, I added, "I would have permitted him the coins for another hour, majesty. A man can bear coins, but not the boy, never the boy." King Alaric was quiet for a moment. Then he did a thing that no king had done at that gate in the memory of anyone living, a thing that got itself into the newspapers and the histories, and I am told, made grown officers of the guard weep when they heard of it. He took off his own glove, a plain gray morning glove, nothing ceremonial, and he held out his bare hand to me, an old man's hand, spotted and strong, and he said, "Then take a king's hand, Halvard Renn, because you have done a king's work this morning, and I will not have it said that the crown let a man stand over coins in its name and gave him nothing in return. Your stillness held my honor when my own household disgraced it. That is not furniture. That is the load-bearing wall of everything I am. Give me your hand." I did not know, in that instant, whether to break attention to take it. There is no line in the standing orders for a king who removes his glove and asks a sentry for his hand. So I did the only thing a disciplined man can do when the orders run out. I trusted the man in front of me over the letter of the rule, because the man in front of me was the reason the rule existed. I shifted my rifle to my left hand, and I took the king's bare hand in my white-gloved right, and I shook it once, firmly, a soldier's grip, in front of the crowd and the camera and the Queen Consort and her ruined son. The forecourt roared again, and this time the old man on the folding stool did not sit back down for a long while. King Alaric released my hand and drew his glove back on and turned, and the softness went out of him entirely, and what was left was 40 years of iron. "Now," he said, "the reckoning." He faced Morwenna and Cassius together, mother and son, the whole grasping vain project of the last decade gathered in two people at the edge of his forecourt, and the crowd went still to hear it. "Morwenna," he said, "I have let you take a great deal. I know I have. I am not a fool, whatever you have decided to believe of me in your quieter moments. I have watched you move into rooms that were not yours and lift things that were not yours and raise wine merchants to barons and build a court inside my court, and I have let it slide because I was tired, and because I have grieved, and because a tired, grieving man tells himself that the small things do not matter and that a peaceful old age is worth a few taken rooms." His voice did not rise, but it deepened, and every word landed like a footstep. I was wrong. The small things are the only things. A house is not its treasury or its towers. A house is how it treats the men who serve it and the children who cannot protect themselves. And this morning your son, in my name and in my colors presence, failed both tests so completely, so publicly, so filmed, that he has done me a strange favor. He has shown me exactly how far the rot had gone while I was telling myself it was nothing. I will not tell myself that again. Alaric Morwenna tried, and her voice had lost all its old command. It was pleading now, and I heard for the first time how frightened she was underneath all the years of iron. He's young. He was foolish. Boys are foolish. You can't ruin a boy's whole life over a foolish morning. I am not ruining his life, Morwenna. You did that. You did it years ago, kindly, lovingly, every single day, by teaching him that he was owed the world and never once letting the world tell him otherwise. I am doing the opposite. For the first time in his life, someone is going to let this boy meet a consequence, and it may be the only gift anyone in this family has ever given him. The king turned to Cassius. Boy, look at me. Cassius looked up. Whatever else I will say of him, and I have tried in this telling to be fair to him, I will grant that in that moment he did look up, and he did not run, and he did not faint, and there was in his ruined face the very first flicker of something I had not seen there all morning. Shame. Real shame. Not the performance of it. The thing itself. You will apologize to that child's teacher, the king said, and through her to that child, and you will do it now, in front of everyone in plain words, with no vein in your mouth. Cassius swallowed. He looked at the teacher and at the small boy peering out from her arms, and haltingly, wretchedly, but genuinely, he said, I'm sorry. I frightened the boy. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. There's no excuse for it. And to the teacher, I'm sorry, madam. It was not eloquent. But it was the first true thing I had heard him say all morning, and it cost him more than all his fine coat and all his mother's name, and the crowd, hearing it, softened a fraction. Because a crowd that will roar at cruelty will also sometimes forgive the first honest shame. And you will apologize to Halvard Renn, the king said. Cassius turned to me. Our eyes met, the boy who had whispered that he would have my post for a joke, and the man who had given him nothing and then moved like lightning to shield a child from him. And I watched him understand at last the whole shape of what he had done and what I had done. And I watched it break something in him, and perhaps begin to build something better in the same motion. I'm sorry, he said to me, and then more quietly, just for the two of us, in an echo of the whisper he'd used against me, but turned all the way around. You could have hit me. All morning you could have. I gave you every reason, and you didn't until it wasn't about you anymore. I don't understand how a man does that. You do it, I said, the second and last time I spoke that whole morning, by learning that the post is not about you. Nothing that matters ever is. He looked at me a long moment. Then he nodded and stepped back and was, I think from that morning, a slightly different man. I make no grand claims for his redemption. I do not know the whole of his later life. But I know he never came to the West Gate again, and I know that a letter reached me 2 years on, in a hand I did not recognize, containing no name and 9 copper coins and a single line for the performance. I've spent 2 years learning what you meant. Keep them. And I have kept them in a small box on my mantle, and I look at them sometimes, and I think that a consequence honestly met is the only teacher that ever really works, and that the king had been right. It may have been the only true gift that family ever gave the boy. But that is the future. In the forecourt the king was not finished. He turned back to Morwenna, and his voice was final. You will return to your apartments now, and you will remain there, and this afternoon the king's marshal and my private secretary will call upon you, and we will begin, you and I, the long overdue accounting of everything you have moved, lifted, taken, and claimed in this house that was not yours to move, lift, take, or claim. Every room, every horse, every jewel, every courtesy. We will go through it item by item, and a great deal of it is going to go back to where it belongs, and some of it is going to go to the memory of the woman it belonged to before you, whom this house has not honored as it should, while you have spent a decade spending her memory down to nothing. His voice caught just once on that, the memory of Isolde, the wife he had loved and then steadied. You mistook my tiredness for my consent, Morwenna. They were never the same thing. Go up." And Queen Consort Morwenna, who had run down the great stair to save her son, and arrived only in time to watch him ruined and herself unmasked before the whole kingdom, turned, without a word, because there were no words left that would help her, and walked back toward the castle, alone now, her son trailing behind her at a broken distance, and the crowd parted for them in a silence far more terrible than any jeer. And that, more or less, was the end of the morning at the west gate. The bell rang for noon while the king was still in the forecourt. Cassius had, in the end, lost his wager by the narrowest of margins, though I do not think anyone was keeping the count by then but me. The crowd began, slowly, to disperse, buzzing. The schoolteacher brought little Perrin up to the arch shyly to say thank you, and the king himself crouched down, an old man's careful crouch, to speak to the boy a moment, and I heard him say, "This soldier kept you safe today. Do you know why? Because that is what the king's men are for. Not for coins, not for show, for that. Remember it." And the boy nodded solemnly, and the king straightened, wincing, and the schoolchildren were led away, and the coins were swept up at last from the cobblestones by a groundsman, all but the 9 that would find their way, 2 years later, into a box on my mantle. I resumed my post. That is the truth of it, and the part of the story I am proudest of, though it will sound strange. After a king had shaken my bare hand and named me the load-bearing wall of his honor in front of a roaring crowd, I did the only thing there was to do. I brought the rifle back to my shoulder, and I set my heels together, and I fixed my eyes forward on the little bronze lion with its worn smooth nose, and I stood the rest of my watch, still and silent and immaculate, exactly as I had stood it at dawn, as though nothing at all had happened. Because that is the post. The post does not change because the morning was extraordinary. The post is the promise you keep with your body whether anyone is watching or no one is, whether a king honors you or a lord mocks you, and the whole worth of it is precisely that it does not bend to either. I had held it through the mockery. I would hold it through the honor. That is the discipline. That is the entire discipline, and I have never known any other worth having. But a morning like that one does not end when the crowd goes home. It has a wake, the way a great ship has a wake, and the wake ran through Harrowgate Castle for months, and I will tell you the shape of it, because a story that shows the wrong met and then does not show what the meeting cost and changed is only half a story, and you deserve the whole of it. The video went out that night, as Cassius had promised, but not as Cassius had planned. Sabine, to her small credit, did not edit it into the trophy her friend had wanted. Whether from conscience or fear or simple accuracy I never learned, but she posted the whole of it, unclipped. The coat on the rifle, the coins laid at my boots, the 4 words at the child, the king's bare hand held out to a sentry. By morning it had been watched more times than there were people in the kingdom, and the thing the whole kingdom took from it was not the thing Cassius had set out to prove. They did not see a lord putting a servant in his place. They saw a rich boy break himself against a wall of quiet discipline, and a plain captain hold a gate with a pencil, and a child made safe, and an old king come down alone in a plain coat to shake a soldier's hand. It became, I am told, a kind of parable that season. Parents showed it to their children, officers showed it to their recruits, and a phrase from it entered the common speech of the city for a while. He gave him nothing. People said it of anyone who met provocation with dignity. He gave him nothing. I have heard it said by strangers who had no idea they were quoting my worst and best morning back to me. The accounting the king had promised began that very afternoon, and it did not stop for the better part of a year. The king's marshal and the private secretary went through the castle room by room and ledger by ledger, and a great deal of what Morwenna had quietly gathered to herself over her decade in the house went back to where it belonged. Rooms that had been closed to the king's own children were reopened. The late Queen Isolde's memory, which had been let to fade under Morwenna's long shadow, was honored again, her portrait rehung in the long gallery, her name spoken again at the proper occasions, a small annual observance restored that Morwenna had quietly let lapse. The king, having decided at last to stop sliding, found that he had more fight left in him than anyone, including himself, had known. Grief had made him tired, but the sight of cruelty done in his name at his own gate had woken something older than the grief, and it did not go back to sleep. Morwenna remained Queen Consort. The king was too old and too weary and too dignified for the ugliness of an open break, and that would come, in its own time, in its own story, years down the road. But her power in the house was finished from that morning. Everyone had seen the king say be quiet, Morwenna, and watched her go white and obey. A court runs on the perception of power far more than on power itself, and the perception had shattered in a forecourt in front of a camera, and it could not be reassembled. Her hangers-on drifted. The wine merchant twins found other patrons. Doran, I heard, left the city entirely. The bright, hungry court she had built inside the king's court simply evaporated over that year, the way morning mist does, once the sun has come up and shown it for what it was. And Cassius, I have told you already of the letter and the 9 coins and the box on my mantle. I will not pretend I loved him, or that one morning made him a good man, or that consequence is a magic that transforms the cruel into the kind. It is not. But I believe it made him, for the first time in his life, a real man rather than a manufactured one, a man who had met one hard, true wall and not been destroyed by it but taught by it. He went abroad for a time. He came back quieter. He never sought the west gate again, and when our paths crossed once, years later, at a distance across a courtyard, he inclined his head to me, a small grave bow. Guard to Lord reversed, and I returned it, and neither of us said a word, and that was the whole of our reconciliation, and it was enough. As for me, Halvard Renn, I stood the west gate for 4 more years after that morning, and then my knee gave out for good and I was retired with honor. And the king, who kept every promise he made that day, saw to it that my retirement was a comfortable one, and sent me on the last day of my service a plain gray glove folded in a wooden box with a card in his own hand that read only, "You held my honor at the gate. I hold yours now." I have that box beside the other one, the one with the coins, on my mantle, and my daughter, who is an officer now herself in the king's colors, asks me sometimes about them. And I tell her this story, the whole of it, exactly as I have told it to you. And when she asks me, as she always does at the end, what the lesson of it is, I tell her the truth, which is the same truth the old king spoke to a small boy in a forecourt long ago, the same truth his father spoke to him 60 years before that, the truth that is the whole of what the king's guard is for, and the whole of what I gave my life to. The measure of a house is not how it treats the men it must impress. It is how it treats the men who must not answer it, and the children who cannot protect themselves. Cassius Vane came to my gate believing my silence made me nothing, that a man who would not answer could not answer, that discipline was a cage I was trapped in. He had it exactly backwards, as the cruel and the entitled always do. My silence was not weakness. It was strength held level and kept loaded, spent on nothing, until the one thing worth spending it on stepped into the arch. The stillness was never the absence of the man. The stillness was the man, all of him, held ready, for the moment that mattered. He tried to humiliate the guard. He humiliated only himself, because a disciplined man cannot be humiliated by contempt. He can only be revealed by it, and what my stillness revealed, coin by coin, was that the small man was the one doing the mocking. And when at last the king stepped in, he did not need to punish anyone. The punishment had already happened, in full view of the whole kingdom, done entirely by Cassius Vane to Cassius Vane. The king only had to walk down alone in a plain coat, and name the thing that was true, and take a soldier's bare hand, and let the whole watching world see clearly, in the light of one ordinary morning, the difference between a name and a man. I gave him nothing, and it turned out to be the most that a man in my position had to give, and exactly enough. The gate held. The child was safe. the house was mended. And the man who does not move, does not speak, and does not break, until duty or honor demands it, went back to his post and stood, and watched the sun travel slow across the cobblestones, and kept his promise with his body, as he had every day for 19 years, and would for 4 years more. That is the whole of the story of the morning the Queen Consort's family came to humiliate the guard at the castle, and were humiliated instead by nothing but their own conduct and a soldier's stillness. And of the day the king came down alone, and stepped in, and set it right.